Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the session on transport innovation and COVID-19 recovery, the short and long-term impacts of COVID-19 on travel demand in urban areas. We will have three distinguished speakers with us today. We will be able to listen to three presentations of around 15 minutes each, and then afterwards have the chance to also ask questions. And please do use the live questions, the live Q&A. I'll be following the questions, and that way you can directly ask your question to the speaker and also get feedback directly after the session. My name is Torsten Klimke. I am head of unit in DG Move, the European Commission's department for transport and mobility, and they're dealing with innovation and research and also urban mobility issues. And therefore, I'm really happy that I have been invited to moderate the session as we are currently reflecting on an update of the urban mobility policy in the European Union. Some of you might have seen already a roadmap that we've published by the European Commission on this revision of the Urban Mobility Initiative. And in a couple of weeks, I hope around early June, we will launch a stakeholder consultation and a questionnaire, which will actually pick up several of the questions on which we will hear first insights today in the session. So you're very welcome to have a look at the questions and also at the roadmap now, and see what to reply and which of these relate to your individual situation. And so I'm really happy that I can already learn now a little bit about the impact and on the long term and on the short term of COVID on travel demand. I would like to start now with the first session. In the first presentation, we have with us Giovanni Circella. Dr. Circella is director of the Three Revolutions Future Mobility Program at the University of California, Davis, and he's also a senior research engineer of the Georgia Institute of Technology. And of course, of the well-known transport research board, TRB, he is chairing the Standing Committee on ICT and Transportation, and also is a member of the Travel Behavior and Values Committee. So very well equipped and with expertise and experience to tell us about the investigation of temporary versus long-term impacts and on the mobility behavior. So Giovanni, please, the floor is and the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, and good morning, everybody. Good afternoon for those of you in Europe. Thank you for having me today to talk a little bit about the research that we are conducting at the University of California, Davis, to investigate the temporary versus longer-term impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on mobility. And this is really a teamwork I have the pleasure to present. And so at the end, I will have a slide showing all the team members that have been working with me at UC Davis and other institutions to collaborate on this research. So jumping into the topic, I hope you can see my screen. Clearly the pandemic has brought a huge impact over the past year on transportation. The same way in which the pandemic has heavily impacted the organization of many activities, from the way we conduct our jobs to the way we organize our household activities. We have seen a lot of huge reductions in travel, in particular in the first stage of the pandemic during spring 2020, with a steep reduction in the use pretty much of every mode in the United States as well as in other countries. However, what was interesting in the second stage of the pandemic was that after that initial decline, not surprisingly, the use of private cars has somehow bounced back, while still the use of share modes remains much lower. So if we look at on the left side of the screen, you can see, for example, data from California, from the Apple mobility trends. The data are very, very similar if we look at street-like data or Google data. We see really that the use of private cars has bounced back, while share modes like public transportation, but also new app-based services remains to be much lower. And still today, if we look like what is happening in the last month, for example, with the reopening of many activities, this is a graph from Enric's data. We see that in many locations, actually, the vehicle miles traveled and the number of trips has really gone back to levels which are even above those from before the pandemic in many areas. And at least in the United States, in many cities and in many metro areas, we're seeing that in particular the afternoon peak is back, while the morning peak, because of the reduced number of commutes, is still below the levels from before the pandemic. However, at the same time, there is only a certain amount of information we can extract from the analysis of passively collected data, which is one of the reasons for which UC Davis will launch a large mobility study, which really integrates the use of passively collected data with a rich set of data we have collected from surveys. And we were somehow lucky because we could build on previous data collections. You see them on the box on the left side of the screen, because we have respondents from before the pandemic. So we have thousands of respondents that participated in previous mobility research and survey data collection in 2018 and 2019. So we could constitute a baseline of information from before the pandemic. What we did with resample the same respondents and also refresh the panel with additional respondents during the first stage of the pandemic in spring 2020. We did it again in fall 2020, collecting information at different times during the pandemic. And we're continuing to do that now in spring 2021. We'll continue to do it next year. So today we will not have the possibility to go into all the details of this research, but I invite you to check the website postcovid19mobility.ucdavis.edu, where you can find more information on this project. Let me dive a little bit more into the database structure and the information that we have. So as I mentioned, we have respondents from before the pandemic, and then this was enriched by the round of data collection during the pandemic, during the first stage of the pandemic. We have a large data set that was collected again during the fall 2020, with many of these being the same respondents from the previous waves. And now we are in the stage of the new round of survey invitations in spring 2021, and we hope to retain as many as possible of these thousands and thousands of respondents moving forward after the pandemic to continue to study this problem and inform planning processes. So what are the type of information we collect in all these projects? We really use the similar survey content in all different stages of data collection, collecting a broad range of information on attitudes and preferences on several different topics, from the environment to transportation to fiscal policies and so on. But also information about the use of technology and how that changed during the pandemic, employment status, working remotely, study activities, household organization, but also detailed information about shopping trips, use of online shopping, detailed travel choices and use of various modes for different type of trips, the adoption of emerging transportation services, but also changes happening in the households in terms of household vehicle ownership, a potential to acquire a new vehicle or replace the current vehicle and so on. And of course, we have very detailed information about household and individual social demographics. So let me dive into some selecting findings, being aware that in the limited time today, we will not have the possibility to go into all the different findings, but I will be very happy to follow up with the many different scientific papers we are writing on these topics, as well as reports for planning agencies that we are working on to really inform planning and policy making processes. So I will start talking about something which is very important. It has to do with equity. The pandemic, we know, certainly has affected different groups of individuals in different ways. And so our data confirms somehow that individuals in lower income households were more likely to report that they were financially struggling, not only in a way that they are more likely to report that they have troubles in paying their bills every month, but also because they are much more likely to report that they were either furloughed without pay, they have lost their job, or their place of employment completely went out of business. And this is something to consider also when we analyze the travel patterns and all the other implications of mobility. Well, among those that still have a job and they still had the need to perform their activities. If we track in the longitudinal data set, so we're now focusing only on those that do have a job also during the pandemic. And so they have continued employment during all stages of the pandemic. And we have data from before, during, and after the pandemic, and the various stages of the pandemic. We can see that the adoption of remote working has increased substantially in the last few months, with many respondents moving from a category of telecommuting 0 days a week to really working remotely, in many cases 5 days a week. And so the big question also remains, like, how this will continue to evolve in the future. Well, of course, like, we know that not everybody has the same possibility of working remotely. In the United States, demographers say there is about a ceiling of 30–35% of the population that can relatively comfortably work remotely. The other workers need to go in person. Well, the reality is that in some areas like the San Francisco Bay Area or Manhattan in New York, the proportion of workers that can work remotely is even higher. But on average, what we see is that lower income workers tend to be more often are considered essential workers, that they have to continue to physically commute to work during the pandemic. And as we see here in these three graphs, with the low income, middle income, and high income, the individuals in the high income groups, and the graphs will be very similar if you look by education or type of job, employment, and field, and so on. The higher income individuals and white collar workers are much more likely to move into the green area where they work remotely more often, while lower income individuals tend to do it less often. We don't really observe big significant differences by age and gender, and we're studying this topic in more details right now to really study also the propensity to continue to telecommute, which on a part-time basis is likely to continue this proportion of these respondents. But we can discuss that perhaps more in the question and answer. I want to dive a little bit also into the change in the use of various travel modes, because as we said at the beginning, in particular, there was a sharp decline in the use of all modes, but there was some silver lining. Even if public transportation was declining, for example, we saw some increase in the active modes. This was in particular for non-work related trips, discretionary travel. So something that is a new habit starting during the pandemic. People walking and bicycling more in the US is not very common in particular, but something that could be somehow promoted with policy to remain. More concerning is that a substantial portion of those that have reduced their use of public transportation, they have also increased their use of cars. So at least in the US, our data are showing a net mode shift from public transportation to cars that is happening in big cities. And this is something potentially concerning when we think also at the impact of the pandemic in the longer term, because we have habits formation and so on. Of course, the opposite is not happening. Those that reduce the use of cars usually either continue not to use public transportation, as it often is the case in the US, or they also decrease the use of public transportation. Well, many other changes are happening in the shopping behaviors. I will cite two quick findings. One is, for example, for online shopping. What our data are showing is somehow a democratization of e-shopping, in which the use of online shopping is expanding also in categories that were not early adopters. So older individuals, the people that don't live in central urban cores of the cities. So somehow we still see the expansion of the user base of online shopping, which is actually something that makes us believe that the pandemic has accelerated a trend that was already happening, and probably we're in the presence of a more permanent change, potentially with longer term impacts on the economy. Still, we see low-income households lagging behind in the adoption of e-shopping. Different story somehow for the food delivery apps. The food delivery apps, at least in the United States, is still mainly a urban, highly educated, younger, dynamic segment of the population phenomenon. And we see also a big correlation between those that increase the use of food delivery apps with a reduction in restaurants visits, which makes us feel, that we will confirm with our analysis of longitudinal data also in the next stages of the data collection, that perhaps at least partially this trend might reverse when these patterns return to restaurants. Well, I will close with the final topic, which is really how the pandemic is changing our relationship with private vehicles. So there is a potential that the pandemic is leading to an increasing car dependence of society. We see that a sizable portion of survey respondents is reporting an interest in increasing vehicle ownership in their household. Some of them have already purchased a vehicle, an additional vehicle during the pandemic. And this is actually somehow concerning a little bit more likely among individuals that they live in households with no vehicles currently. So we see on the right side of the slide with the graph showing no household vehicle, the no presence of a vehicle in the household, with a little bit of a higher proportion of individuals that want to increase their vehicle ownership. And in general, our attitudinal data, I cannot dive now for lack of time, but I can mention that the interest of adopting a car-light or car-less multimodal lifestyle is declining, unfortunately. We're controlling compared to information before the pandemic. Interestingly, the dependence of cars is also seen from the fact that those that report that really want to definitely own a car always been a majority, in particular in higher income categories and so on, but it's actually spreading more in lower income categories also as the pandemic evolves. So somehow a little bit of reverse of the trend that we expected before doing this data collection. The more we dive into the pandemic, the more many respondents actually report a slightly increased interest in owning vehicles, also among the lower income groups and those that actually live without a car today. So somehow something concerning. So to wrap up, I will mention a few topics that I think is particularly important, and we can discuss more with all the participants for answering any questions they might have. I touched the equity issues that touch several different topics associated with the impact of employment, on the travel modes, but also on potentially the technology gap associated with the use of new technology-based services. The impacts on traffic congestion and environmental impacts are actually something to really consider. We see, I haven't had the time here to mention a lot of details, but we see not only the switch from commuting trips to some discretionary trips that can at least in part offset the reduction in travel because of reduced commuting trips. We also see a shift in time because individuals do fewer commuting trips and more discretionary travel. We see a shift, for example, from the morning AM peak towards the midday and the late morning or the beginning of the travel. So somehow silver lining, a little bit reduced travel, maybe will continue also in particular in the AM peak in the morning. We also have registered some substitution, at least in the US market, of airplane trips with car travel. Something very important to consider. The market is also changing, so how this will evolve in the future. And of course, like the big question is how the supply will also change for transit and so on. So 3 things to consider also on the supply side that will affect demand in the future. We have changes in supply happening, mergers and acquisitions. The US market has already seen mergers between Jump and Lime that somehow accelerated by the pandemic. This will continue this process and will certainly affect demand. Cities are also deploying policies. We are reclaiming some space for cars. We're having more space for bicyclists. We will have some more longer term impacts. And so I will close really with a question that everybody asks me when I talk about this topic and this research, which is, will we go back to previous life? Certainly before doing this research, we could already say that the literature says that usually when there is a perturbance, when we remove the disruption, individuals tend to go back to their previous travel behaviors. However, the longer the disruption, the more higher likelihood that we might have some longer term impacts. And we might already assess somehow that some increasing in shopping will likely persist. The retail space has been forever reshaped because we see already a lot of business models not being current anymore and shops are running out of business. Economic activities will take time to recover, but also we see, at least in the transition, some travelers remaining hesitant to use share modes, some increase in vehicle ownership, especially with the reduction of the discretionary users that decide not to own a car. In the US, those are those that are buying more vehicles and they are reporting intention to do that soon. They might form new car-dependent habits. We also know that transit supply will likely continue to be changed in the future because of mergers and acquisitions, changes in investments, funding issues, and then there's a big role of policy. And so, especially if we try to promote policies that promote active travel and try to reduce the resurgence of car travel. I just want to acknowledge the research team. There will be a lot of other topics we could mention in this research, but we don't have the time today. Maybe we can touch some of them in the question and answer time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Giovanni. Very, very interesting, and you perfectly managed the time. I immediately had a question when listening to you. In your research and in your data, did you observe also changes relating more or less to the travel behavior as such. So which kind of mode of transport or how much do I move, but also towards either cleaner or maybe not so clean means of transport, safety issues of the different ways of mobility. Did that play also a role? Did you observe any kind of changes during the pandemic in these aspects? Thanks.
Yeah, excellent question. So in the travel behavior data that we have collected, what we observe is the more fundamental and interesting aspects is somehow an increased interest in active modes of transportation in cities, especially for discretionary travel. Makes sense. Those that are working from home tend to be more likely to walk or bicycle for recreational purposes, for non-work related purposes. A big resistance to use of public transportation that is declining. So actually, the big resistance was in particular in the first phase of the pandemic. We see that being scared of public transportation is getting reduced. So some travelers are actually being more likely to return. We also have data about the changes in attitudes towards alternative fuel vehicles and more sustainable options. We didn't go into details today. We are actually analyzing them to see, like, if attitudes have shifted fundamentally during the pandemic, because, for example, different environmental sensitivities or different interests. But we are looking currently at interest in adopting hybrid electric vehicles, purely battery electric vehicles, other alternative fuel vehicles like fuel cells, hydrogen vehicles, and I will be happy to follow up on that once we analyze more of those data, in particular from the longitudinal perspective. It would be interesting to see how these aspects are changing from the past.
Mm-hmm. Thanks very much, Giovanni. I see we have a question coming in from Mauro, asking whether you also considered choices relating to the place where people choose to live and possible impact on transit. So we might see some changes there as well, I guess.
Excellent question, and thank you so much for asking that. I actually had a slide on residential location. I removed it because of lack of time. But yes, we are seeing changes in the intentions of where to live, which is something very interesting. However, at the same time, I would say that when we look at the intentions, there is certainly a high right now because of the emotional response to the pandemic, we believe. Because the proportion of individuals that are reporting an interest in moving outside of the cities to more suburban areas, to more rural areas, and so on, seems to be extremely high versus those that actually move in the average year. Now, when we match the data between an intention to move versus an actual decision to move, we see that those that are moving are actually a much more focused subgroup. So in most cases, those that are moving in the US market, at least, are the more dynamic mobile segment of the population, individuals that are leasing, renting their unit, they don't own, individuals that tend to be younger, don't have children, because that is a very important determinant in the United States for the choice of where to live, the quality of the school district. Of course, I'm talking about those that have a choice, because there is also another group that has to move because of financial constraints. They cannot pay rent anymore and so on. But among those that move by choice, usually right now we are seeing like the shifts, in particular in the big cities like San Francisco or New York City, with very, very high cost of rent, and individuals that tend to move, like, for example, in California, where we are located in areas with more amenities and so on. But right now, those that are actually moving tend to be the more mobile segments of the population. In the Silicon Valley, many companies are allowing an entire year remote working. Many workers, instead of renting a very expensive place in the Mission District of San Francisco, they're moving into Lake Tahoe or beautiful areas where the rent is 1/3 and the amenities and pleasure of the place is much higher. But those segments are also very dynamic and very mobile, so they could reverse the trend also relatively easily. I see many times mentioned a topic that cost of housing is going up a lot in suburban areas, and many interpret that as a big shift of families also to suburban areas. I want to mention that we need to think that in the US, we have a shortage in the housing market. Few units available on the market, very low mortgage rates that encourage a lot of people to buy. So even a tiny switch in demand is actually generating a big shift in pricing because the supply is limited. But I would say that the shift to move is mainly for the mobile segments of the population right now.
Thanks very much, Giovanni. And for the moment, there seem to be no more questions. Mauro is thanking you for this answer. So it seems to have been comprehensive and appreciated in any case. So Giovanni, thanks very much. You'll stay with us because we see towards the end, maybe some more questions will come up, or maybe even during the other presentations, and we have a chance then to discuss a bit further. Thanks again. And
thank you so much.
And good morning also to the American continent. I totally forgot. I was assuming that we are all in the afternoon. I don't know how long I've been staying in the Brussels time zone for more than a year anyway. So you forget sometimes. Yeah?
It's a little bit earlier here.
Yes. Looking forward to experiencing it myself at some stage again. Yeah? Okay, thanks, Giovanni. Let's move then to Marije Hamersma, who will tell us about the impact of COVID on mobility from a Dutch perspective, and share with us the first insights based on the Netherlands mobility panel. Marije works at the KIM Netherlands Institute for Transport Policy Analysis. And with this, in this position and in this function, provides important policy input to the Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management. And Marije's research and activities focus on personal mobility, and she has done several recent studies on the relationship between COVID-19 and mobility. And we're eager to hear from you about the results of these studies. So Marije, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the nice introduction. Hello, everybody. I'm going to show my slides now. I think it works. In the next couple of minutes, I like to tell you something about the impact of COVID-19 on mobility in the Netherlands. And this is work I'm doing together with my colleagues Matthijs de Haas, who's also present here today and is happy to answer your questions after my talk, and my colleague Roel Faber. Oh, and now my mouse is not working. Let's see what I can do about that. Yeah, now it is. Well, we started this research at the beginning of the pandemic appearing in the Netherlands. In the end of February 2020, the first COVID patients appeared in the Netherlands. And soon after that, the Dutch government announced a so-called intelligent lockdown. This was a lockdown with measures like bars and restaurants being closed, schools being closed, the urge to work from home as much as possible, and the advice to travel only for necessary reasons. After that, several periods of relaxations followed again by lockdowns when the amount of COVID increased again. And at this moment, we're slowly heading towards first relaxations again, also as there is an increasing number of people being vaccinated. And already from the beginning of the pandemic appearing in the Netherlands, there was a strong interest in knowing what was going on and knowing about what the impact of the virus in itself and its measures has on mobility. In addition, we thought it would be interesting to also get a bit of a feeling about what kind of structural impacts might be expected after COVID. So with those two goals in mind, we started to do research from the beginning of the pandemic. And we did this by using the Netherlands Mobility Panel, as was already introduced by the chair of the session, which is in Netherlands, in Dutch, called the MPN. And we started this panel in 2013. It consists of persons within households of 12 years and older. And we asked those people at several moments in time to fill out different surveys and a 3-day travel diary. We do this at least once a year in September, October, but in between there are all kinds of possibilities for additional surveys. And that is what we also did during COVID. So we asked a representative subsample of about 2,000 people to fill out surveys through time. And the last measurement we did was in April 2021. However, this data has not been analyzed yet. So if you want to know more about that, I think soon there will be more information on our website. It's also possible to use the data of the MPN yourself. This is possible 2 years after we collect the data. And if you'd like to know more about that, you can send us an email or go to the website. Well, in the next slides, I'd like to tell you something about the findings of our study, our ongoing research on 3 specific themes. First of all, outdoor activities. Second, the impacts on work and education. And third, on travel in itself. Well, with regards to outdoor activities, what we can see is that already from the beginning of the pandemic, people indicated to do much less outdoor activities than they were doing pre-COVID. Especially the amount of visits to other people has dropped. And what we can also observe is that during relaxations in June, July 2020, the amount of activities outdoors went a bit back again to normal. And during strict lockdown in January 2021, the amount of people doing less often activities outdoors than pre-COVID increased again. But what about people's expectations for the future? Here we can see on the right that most people expect to go back to normal behavior after COVID has ended. Especially when it comes to visiting people, most panelists expect to go back to their normal behavior. And we also found that most people indicate that digital ways of social interaction do not fully substitute for actual physical meetings. We do see over time that the amount of people expecting to do less outdoor activities over time is increasing a bit. So the amount of people expecting to do less activities is a bit higher in January 2021 than it was during our first measurement in March, April 2020. Well, as I already said, one of the important measures the government took from the beginning of the pandemic was to advise people to work from home as much as possible. And we indeed saw an increase in the share of working from home from the beginning of the pandemic. Before COVID, about 30% of the people we asked worked from home at least a part of the week. And this increased to about 50% at the beginning of the pandemic. During relaxations in June, July, and September, October, the share of working from home dropped a bit, but increased again in January 2021 when we were in strict lockdown. We do see a bit of a difference between the beginning of the pandemic and January 2021 during strict lockdown. If we look at the share of people working almost fully from home, this percentage was much higher at the beginning of the pandemic compared to January 2021. So although people still work a lot from home, the percentage of people working almost fully from home has dropped a bit. We also asked people about their experiences with working from home. And there we see that in general, workers have quite positive experiences. What you can see on the left, about 60 to 70% of people over the different measures months is positive. People are also fairly positive about their working place and the support they get from their employer. They do miss colleagues, however. And additionally, it is important to mention that although about 60 to 70% is positive, there's still a considerable group of people with less positive experiences. We again also asked workers about their expectations for working from home after COVID. And here we can see on the left below that well, for the coming months at least, many workers expect still to work more from home than they did before COVID. About the future, what we can see below, we can also see interesting things. As we can see that there's a considerable percentage of workers expecting to work more from home after COVID than they did before COVID. We can also observe here an increase over time. The percentage of people expecting to work more from home after COVID increased in the last measurements compared to the first measurement we did in March, April 2020. Well, we also asked the students in our panel about their experiences with remote education. In January 2021, during strict lockdown, the schools were closed, what you can see back in this figure. Almost all students studied completely from home at that time. And this picture was about the same at the beginning of the pandemic, March, April 2020. We can see that the experiences of students with remote education are not that positive as what we saw when we looked at workers working from home. About 30% of the students has positive experiences with remote education. However, students seem to be quite okay with the workplace they have, the facilities they have, and the support they get from schools. And we did not see much of a difference between the beginning of the pandemic and January 2021. But we also asked students about their expectations for remote education. Well, here we can see the more negative experiences being reflected. For the coming months, most students still expect to have more remote education as they were used to pre-COVID. However, for the future after Corona, most students expect to go back to their normal way of studying. We do see, however, also here an increase over time with the percentage of students expecting to do more remote education having increased in January 2021 compared to March, April 2020. Well, for the last theme I'd like to tell something about, travel in itself. We saw a large drop of the number of trips and the distances traveled in the beginning of the pandemic. We also saw that the average distance per trip dropped significantly. So people made shorter trips than they did before COVID. You've seen a bit of an increase again during the relaxations, and again a drop in distances and trips in January 2021 during the strict lockdown. It's interesting to see, by the way, that the amount of trips and the distance traveled was a bit higher in January 2021 compared to the lockdown in March, April 2020. We also saw shifts in the model split, especially more shared ways of moving, a car as a passenger, and public transport dropped strongly. While we especially saw an increase in walking in the beginning of the pandemic, we also saw a strong increase in the amount of round trips. So people just making a walk or with a dog, or just go for a biking tour for the sake of doing something, as a lot of other activities were not possible. The drop in share of public transport is also reflected in the attitudes people have for travel modes. You've seen a strong drop in the attitude for train and bus, tram and metro. And while the attitude for car seems to increase a bit, and the attitudes for active modes like biking and walking stayed about the same. This is also reflected in people's expectations with regards to using those modes after COVID. We can see that for public transport, the group of people who is expecting to use those modes less after COVID is much bigger than the group who's expecting to increase usage. For active modes like bike and walking, we do see an opposite picture. And the same is true, but then to a lesser extent for the car. This is also a point for policy, we think. Well, to come to a conclusion, what we can see during COVID were large effects on mobility in the Netherlands, slight changes across measurements, and especially a large drop on mobility in the beginning of the pandemic, when everything was still new and uncertain and people didn't know how long this would take. For after COVID, based on expectations of people, it seems that most people want to go back to pre-COVID outdoor activity behavior. However, we may expect some changes in the way of working, so more working from home, and also some changes in travel behavior. Well, for policy, we think it is at least important to be aware of the increasing importance of ICTs. It was also already mentioned in the previous presentation. ICTs, for example, when it comes to remote working, can bring a lot of advantages, but not everybody is evenly capable of using those ICTs. It's also important to address the digital divide here. Then the drop in usage and attitudes for public transport and the expectation of people to use public transport less after COVID. We think it's important to have policy attention there as well, especially also when we think about urban mobility and congestion and sustainability issues there. As we see that at least a part of people who used public transport before COVID are now using the car. Then the promising potential changes in working from home and active mode use are interesting, but accommodating policies by governments and employers might be needed there to perpetuate those positive effects after COVID. We are very curious to what extent you recognize these impacts and have additional thoughts on policy directions. Well, we have a lot of plans for the next time, especially looking into the structural effects of all of this on mobility, and also want to learn about what is happening in other countries, policy initiatives abroad. So if you want to share about that, we're happy to listen to that. And you can also send us an email on this later. Well, so for now, I would like to thank you for your attention and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Marije, for this very interesting overview. We already have a question in the chat box, but if you allow, I would like to ask a question first on what you showed on public transport, and you rightly pointed out that this is something for policymakers to look into, and it's of course a concern also for us at the European Commission what we can do about this. Did you get any insights in what could be done so that people would feel more, passengers would feel more comfortable about using public transport again? Because it was quite significant, this reduction in the willingness also to use public transport after the pandemic. So do you have any concrete advice on that?
Well, we did not ask this explicitly in our surveys. But maybe, Matthijs, if you have more information on this, please add. But we did find in literature already that things like hygiene play a role. So cleaning transport, make sure that people can have enough distance of each other is important. So that kind of things are important to keep in mind, I think. Matthijs, do you have?
Yeah, maybe I can add something to this, because we asked people what type of measures they would find positive to be able to travel by public transport again. I think we asked this last summer, and for instance, wearing face masks was one thing that people did find a good measure, but at the same time, people indicated that they find it uncomfortable to wear a face mask in public transport. So it's really contradicting insights. And also we are planning, well, we don't have insights yet, but we're planning to do a study into the causal relationship between attitudes and travel behavior, and especially focus on that public transport part, because we see that attitudes have taken a turn for the worse. So we're very eager to know whether those attitudes will go back to being positive again once people start traveling again with public transport, because otherwise it could actually turn out that the structural effects for public transport will be pretty significant.
Thank you very much. Let's turn to Max. Hi, Max, my former colleague. We were former colleagues a long time ago. Max is asking about the relationship between the closure of schools and travel behavior. So do you see that when children stay home, the parents stay home, and the opposite, children go back to school or to kindergarten, and then the parents might drop them and return to the office again? Do you have any insights on that?
I don't think we've studied this relationship directly. What we do see, because people are urged to work from home since the beginning of March, I think, something last year. What we saw in the beginning was that a very high share of people, they work from home completely. And I mean, also schools were closed, so people were forced to work from home, even when they work in schools, and the children are home, so they had to take care for the children. What we see in the following measures was that especially the share of people who worked from home completely dropped a little bit. So people went back to the office 1 or 2 days a week. I don't think we directly studied the relationship between the reopening of schools and the share of working from home. What we did see, which is interesting, but could have to do with the children being home, is that the experiences working from home are less positive for women compared to men. And we're not 100% sure that this has to do with the children being home, but it could be something.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but I think it's an interesting point also to look into.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you for your question about this.
Yeah, and we have a question from Edwin about data on mopeds. So why specifically mopeds? Did it include motorcycles in general? And can you say anything on the shift to MC? I guess that's motorcycles.
I think the share of motorcycles in the Netherlands it's rather low, especially compared to mopeds, because moped is quite a popular mode of transport in certain areas of the Netherlands. So, I mean, motorcycle is included in the MPN as a mode of transport, but the share is really low, so we didn't specifically look at this.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. And then Ronald was asking whether there's a formal arrangement to be working with you or with others, or is this an informal arrangement to coordinate? I guess this relates to what you mentioned, or is it maybe it's more general to everyone?
To use the panel, or
yeah, that's I'm not totally sure. So maybe Ronald, you could, if you don't mind, specifying who you are asking this question to.
Well, if it's about using the panel data, we can just give some information, because we make the data publicly available 2 years after collecting the data, but it's in an anonymized version because we can't give it out for free with all the personal details since we're limited by the GDPR. But the information on our website will give you all possibilities how to access the data, and also there are possibilities to access the data with personal information in it, but that requires things like a data processing agreement.
Okay, thank you very much again, Marije and Matthijs. Let's move to our third presentation, and then we can maybe still pick up some additional questions if they come in after the next presentation. So it's my pleasure to introduce Vishal Mahajan, who will tell us about a local study about the city of Munich. So explaining demand patterns during COVID-19 using opportunistic data and how this affected the city of Munich. Vishal is a civil engineer and specialized in transportation, and he studied both in India, in the Indian Institute of Technology in Roorkee, where he earned a degree in civil engineering, and then continued with a Master of Science degree in transportation systems from the Technical University of Munich in Germany. And he's currently working on his doctoral degree in the area that he will tell us about. So Vishal, the floor is yours, and looking forward to your presentation. Thanks.
Thank you, Torsten, for introducing me. I hope you can see my slides. And I also want to thank the organizers for giving me this platform and the opportunity to present our research. And this work is a joint effort by my colleagues at the Technical University of Munich and myself. So this work is a fair attempt to try to explain how the demand patterns, how we can explain the demand patterns during COVID-19 using some of the opportunistic data. So let's dive into it. So here is the outline of the presentation. I will briefly go into the basics of the activities in the demand and evolution of the patterns in Munich during COVID-19 and what data sources and the methods we used for this study. And then I will list out the findings of the study and also list out the recommendations. So the basic question of activities in the travel demand is core for transportation researchers. So what influences activities in the travel demand? So basically the interaction of the land use and the transport has been very widely researched by the researchers. For example, dense neighborhoods might generate short trips, sparse neighborhoods or sparse crawl, urban sprawl might generate longer trips. Also, are there parking spots nearby? Are there transit stops? How much is the fare? All these factors interact with each other and they influence where, how, when, and people move, right? And over the top of these two factors, then we have special events. Special events by the name itself signify special circumstances which can influence our travel behavior. For example, in the aftermath of earthquake, people might be too afraid to go into the subway. And similarly for the COVID-19 also, due to COVID-19, people might be reluctant to go into the closed spaces or maybe afraid to use the public transport. So with the changing circumstances, people adapt their behavior to maximize the perceived utility and also to minimize the risk. So here is a very familiar graph before you, which my fellow presenters also showed for their respective study areas. So some of the triggers due to COVID-19 were announcement of the lockdown and the mobility restrictions and announcement of the social distancing norms, possibility to work from home. All these triggers resulted in some sort of changes in the behavior of the population. In the early days of the pandemic, there was panic buying, and subsequently there was drop in the transit ridership. And also in many places, a dip in the non-essential retail has been observed. So these special events, first of all, they have very special characteristics, like they are disruptive, they are highly dynamic, and due to this special nature, they pose challenging and difficult questions before the decision makers, like which businesses should they support, what kind of transport services, or what should be the level of the services, how to ensure a specific level of service and the safety for the transport facilities. And to answer these questions, decision makers need to understand the underlying phenomena. For that, they need the data, right? And crowd sense data is a very potential source of information which can help us to understand these complex phenomena. Basically, crowd sense data is made of two words, crowd and the sense. And crowd means it comes from a large number of people. So the information is at a large scale. And the sense means it can be passively collected from the sensors in the building, or it can be, passively collected from the personal devices of the population, such as mobile phones and so on. And basically, here I'm interested in delving more into the PAOI visitational popularity data. I will go into in detail in the further slides. So on the right-hand side, you see a figure where we have a trend in blue and the red. So some of you might be familiar what this shows. This generally shows how much people are in a specific business establishment on a relative scale. So the length of this bar does not shows are there 10 people, are there 100 people, but it shows are there more or are there less. And in the blue, we have a data which signifies historical trend or the usual trend. And in the red, we have the live trend, which is at the current time, how crowded is the specific POI. So we try to exploit this data for our specific task. And for this purpose, we collected this data, and we are not the first ones to use this data. There are already previous studies where people have analyzed venue popularity, local business attractiveness, demand expansion factors, and so on. And one thing to note is that this data is on a limited, has a limited availability. I mean to say, it's not available for all the POIs. It's only available for the limited POIs due to privacy and anonymization concerns. So that's why it, with the benefits, it also has some drawbacks that we cannot get this data for all the POIs. So here is a brief overview of the data collection, the modeling approach. Our study area is the city of Munich, and the time period is basically divided into two parts: before lockdown, for which we have the historical trends, and the after lockdown, which we collected in the April last year, which was a period just after the lockdown in Munich. And we collected this data for approximately 180 places of interest. And the types of these businesses were supermarkets, fast food, and the chemist. And you might ask why only these three? Because due to restrictions, the other places of interest were closed, so we could not get the data for those places. And also, we also tried to collect the data concerning land use and the transport features, such as population density, average distance to the transit stop, and the availability of the parking area near the POI. And then we used two different models to model the popularity as a dependent variable, and the land use and the transport features and the lockdown feature as independent features. So in this equation, which is presented on the top right, you get the abstract overview of the model, where we have the popularity on the left-hand side and the independent features on the right-hand side. So here I want to show you the visualization of the popularity trend. On the top, you see the historical trend of three POIs. Here you can see, for example, the fast food have a trend even on Sunday because they are open, but the supermarkets and the chemists are not open on Sundays in Munich. And on the bottom, you see the comparison of the historical and the live trend, which was collected in the month of April. And here also you can compare that the live trend differs from the historical trend in some aspects. But looking at this cumulative figure, we miss on a lot of which is which is an underlying phenomena. So that's why we go back to the modeling, and we use the modeling and try to analyze if we can correlate some of the features with this popularity trend. So here are the results of our study. So the first, the broad outcome of the study is that there is a variability in the effects of lockdown. All the POIs are not uniformly affected. For example, the fast food related POIs are significantly affected during the lockdown, which is obvious also because the restrictions were aimed at reducing the non-essential retail or non-essential trips. Secondly, we observed that popularity is inversely correlated with the distance from the transit stop, which essentially means the places which are close to the businesses which are close to the transit stop have higher popularity relative to the businesses away from the transit stop. But during the lockdown, an interesting observation was, or the outcome was, this trend is reversed, which means the businesses close to the transit stop have lesser popularity than the businesses away from the transit stop. And this was interesting because it conveys that somehow the location of the business with respect to the transit stop is correlated with the popularity. And the possible reasons, there could be a number of possible reasons for that. Some of the reasons could be people are working from home, and maybe they changed their travel modes from their public transport to the alternative modes like biking or maybe cars. And these factors somehow resulted in reduction in commuters, which we saw in the dip in the ridership. And these commuters were the potential customers for these POIs. And also another outcome is that these trends are not uniform over the days of the week. For different days of the week, we have different trends. For example, during the weekday or the weekend or the Fridays, the trends could differ, which we also saw how the trends evolved during the week. And the second model which we used also gave us the similar results as the linear model. So basically this increases the confidence in our results. And before I move on to the recommendations, I would like to overemphasize that these results should not be transferable to the other cities as such. For example, maybe this phenomena resulted in different impacts in the city of New York or in the city of Paris, because there are different factors which come into play, such as enforcement of the restrictions and what kind of restrictions were announced. But one takeaway is that this approach is transferable because the data sets or the data sources we used are almost globally available all over the world. And yeah, like every study, our study has also have some limitations. And all the limitations which come with the data also applies to our study, such as the sample bias, which I earlier also mentioned. Some of the features, some of the POIs don't have any popularity data, so we miss an analysis on them. And also our models had a somewhat lower R-square values between 30 to 60, 0.3 to 0.6, which indicates this phenomena is too complex to explain with the selected features. So maybe adding more features such as income or social demographics, or maybe diversifying the list of the land use features could help us to get more out of these models. An interesting further area or further research could be analyzing the long-term evolution of the trends, because our current study is only focused on a very specific short interval of time. And this actually has been continued in one of our projects where the work is currently ongoing. And also, as I previously stated, popularity data only gives a relative information on the relative impact of the restrictions. Maybe we can fuse this data with the extrinsic data to estimate absolute effects on how many, what is the absolute effects on the ridership, what is the absolute effect on the traffic. So here are some of the recommendations from this study. So based upon the correlation with the distance to the transit stop, we can conclude that we need to adapt the transit-oriented development principles so that resilience of the businesses which are close to the stops can be improved. How to help those businesses get back to normal due to the drop in the ridership. And this data can have direct applications for crowd management, because in such a dynamic situations, we need some immediate sources of the data for quick action. Obviously, surveys are one of the best and the richest sources of the information, but as we all agree, the surveys take some time in designing and planning and the execution. So crowd sense data or the popularity data could be an alternate sources of the data for short-term study or for the analysis of short-term effects. And also, I cannot overemphasize the importance of data sharing between practitioners and researchers for common and the societal goals, because this study would not have been possible if these data would not have been publicly available. So the cities and the researchers and the practitioners should come together to share traffic and the transit data sources. There are already some good examples all over the Europe, all over the world, such as city of Paris, which have quite sophisticated open data platforms where you can get a diverse and the detailed list of data sources. And obviously, when we are using these data, when data owners have a responsibility to ensure data privacy and also to ensure the commercial risk. So all these concerns should be taken into account while sharing. And one important aspect which I myself encountered was that it is not enough for a data to be available. It should be usable. It should be linked to some metadata and all the characteristics so that it can be used. A lot of information on the open data platforms is sometimes not usable. So maybe this is also something which we should look into so that the usability of the data can be improved. Thank you. That was all. And this work has already been published in the European Transport Research Journal. And if you're interested to go into more detail, you can scan this QR code and this will take you directly to the paper. And if you have any other questions, you can please ask me now. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much, Vishal. That was very interesting. And we already have a question, and please don't hesitate to put in additional questions either to Vishal or also to Giovanni or Marije, because we have a few minutes left. But if I may ask one question first, Vishal, it was very interesting your findings about the frequency of shops or places of interest being visited at hubs or in other locations. Did you also observe then maybe deliveries or something from those that were less? So rather than people going to places, that deliveries were increasing, or maybe not, from some shops or some places. Did you have any data on that?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question. As you already put it, yeah, maybe lesser people are going, but the deliveries increase. Unfortunately, this kind of data does not allow us to go into a lower level of abstraction, because the data is collected based upon how many mobile phones or how many users are around that place of interest. And so we cannot get any information on the deliveries. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And data, of course, Ronald also has a question on data. And you touched upon it in your presentation already, because you were talking about open data. It's a key interest. And so how important was open data in your in the work? How significant was it? And what about non-open data? Were you able to access it or not? So how do you see this?
Yeah, so this is also a very interesting question for me, because I firsthand experienced all these issues. So first of all, I would take a step forward from the open to the publicly available data, because open data is classified as one which has the open license. So for me, we use quite a lot publicly accessible data, such as we used data for good from Facebook, which is publicly accessible online, and for estimating the population density. We use OpenStreetMaps a lot for estimating these transport related features. And then we also use this popularity data, which is publicly available, but it's not open. So the difference is, although we use this data, but we cannot distribute this data, right? So because we don't have the license for distributing this data. And the other, yeah, so I think that's all. But we were really wishing to get more data on income, average income in the locality, for example, or richer information on the socio-demographics. that could really help us to maybe add more features, as I earlier also explained, to get more information out of it.
Thank you. And I see we have a question from Veronique to Giovanni and Marije about the positive experiences. So people had to shift or during the pandemic to, for example, biking or walking, and they might have discovered during this experience that they actually liked it a lot, or maybe not. So what do you, how do you see this? How do you see this kind of behavioral change, which was forced in the beginning, but maybe people started to like it? I don't know who wants to come. Marije, maybe first.
Yeah, sure. Nice question indeed. What we indeed see is that many people, especially in the beginning of the pandemic, but also later on, still many people started to make more short tours, just make a book or go for a bike tour. And we indeed noticed that there are quite some people who indicate that they are expecting to do this more as well after COVID. So it does seem to look like indeed people discovered this type of behavior as being healthy. Could also be a combined thing together with working from home, as people don't have the travel time anymore, but then instead, for example, go for a walk in between a day of working from home, for example. So it seems based on expectations of people that there's indeed an increasing this, and we're very interested to follow this.
Thanks, Marije. And Giovanni, what's your experience or your findings on this?
Absolutely. So we ask information about how the individuals are enjoying their current things they're doing in terms of use of the various type of modes of transportation, but also for working from home, in terms of productivity, in terms of a sense of isolation from their colleagues, lack of social relationship, also interaction with other individuals and so on. Also as a matrix to see, like, the level of satisfaction with the current things they're doing, and how that affects also the intention to continue to do some of these things. Currently, what we are really digging into is to identify who is doing what, because we see, like, this potentially going in different ways in different subgroups of the population. For example, we have those that have somehow abandoned public transportation, and they are getting more and more attached to their car and finding the habit formation in the use of the car, which is a common thing in the US, but there was a niche that was not very car dependent. That niche is shrinking. And it's important to see whether it's a more temporary thing of the habit formation, and the satisfaction with those new patterns will lead to continue that trend. On the other end, like, as the respondent was mentioning, the continuation of active travel, for example, and potentially expansion of active travel, because in the US in particular, most of the active travel increase that we are measuring is known for essential trips, for transportation trip purposes, but it's mainly associated with recreational trips. And so the question is how to transfer that from recreational purposes to essential trip purposes for either work or non-work purposes. And then the other big question is how that translates in mobility patterns. We could talk more about that, but we don't have the time now. Because the big question is how they translate in congestion levels and volume of traffic and demand in the various times of the day.
Thank you very much, Marije and Giovanni. I see that Jose has asked a question to Vishal on data access for Paris, and maybe you can even do this bilateral, because I'm afraid our session is coming to an end. I would like to thank you so much, Giovanni, Marije, and Vishal. This was extremely interesting. Unfortunately, like always, not enough time we could have discussed many more questions, but looking forward to seeing you again soon and maybe continuing then. So thanks to you, thanks to everyone who attended, and have a nice afternoon or still a nice morning in the US. Yes. Okay, thank you so much, and see you soon. Bye-bye.